My name is Emma Cagle, and today we're going to be discussing movement in academia, a discussion on ableism in college courses, and specifically we're going to be looking at attendance policies here at Penn State. College recently is clearly defined best as the American dream for every student exiting high school and moving on to the next chapter of their life. College seems like the most logical choice. It is not only required for most and many degree paths, it is also something that parents of a later generation have instilled in their children as something that is necessary because it will prepare them for the future and give them more opportunities than they had if they hadn't gone to college. So when kids leave high school, the first thing they're going to do is get themselves ready, take their SATs, their ACTs, any AP or IB test scores, all of those things go together to help a student get into college. And the idea of college has become a founding principle. So for students that are in college, it's clear that there's a certain type of college student that is preferable. It's the student that does well on their tests, the student that comes to every class and they come to every class prepared, they're always submitting their work on time, and they don't have any problems. That would be the ideal student. It is the job of a high school education to prepare students not only to succeed in college, but to be the ideal student. However, not every student can be the ideal student. Not only are these ideals unfair, they're also incredibly exclusive. So knowing what a college student looks like, it's also really important to define what a college student doesn't look like. For the students that don't come to class, the ones that don't go to office hours, the ones that don't go the extra mile, those are the students that tend to be thought of not as the ideal college student. But the problem is that that's such a surface level understanding of what the college student is and the daily struggles that they go through. So just because a student doesn't show up for class doesn't mean that they're lazy, doesn't mean that they're not trying hard in their curriculum and their work, or that they want to do good. It just might mean that these college courses are inaccessible to them. And college is exclusive. For so many students, and today we're going to be focusing on students with disabilities, all sorts of disabilities, psychiatric, physical, learning, mental disabilities. College is something that isn't always accessible. The biggest reason of this is that there's strict attendance policies for most college classes to supposedly weed out lazy students who don't want to come, don't want to participate. But the real students it ends up affecting are those with disabilities that are still trying to get the most out of their education and fit into the ideal of the ideal college student. So in this way, colleges, college campuses, and even the idea of college has become specifically curtailed to a certain kind of student. And for those that are excluded, college isn't always a possibility. But again, this is the norm. For colleges to be exclusive sometimes means that they're better. The most sought after colleges are sometimes the most exclusive, and we can take a look at that later. But yeah, so this is just kind of how we're going to begin to frame the conversation, specifically how students with disabilities are able to navigate college, specifically looking at attendance policies. But the first thing to do is to delve into this idea of students with disabilities. And the first thing to do is kind of define what ableism is. So ableism is defined by the Center for Disability Rights as a set of beliefs or practices that devalue and discriminate against people with physical, intellectual, or psychiatric disabilities, and often rest on the assumption that disabled people need to be fixed in one form or the other. So ableism is a very widespread belief, unfortunately. It's something that people don't always see themselves as being conscious as doing. A good example would be simply to look at what I'm doing right now. I'm sitting down in a chair, which is not typical for most presenters. People think that usually you should stand up, but standing up isn't accessible. That's not something that everyone can do. It's something I can do, but I'm choosing not to in this sense, and I'm breaking that norm that people have of what a presenter looks like. Even going further, just into the idea of college campuses, being able to walk up and down tons of stairs is a very, very, very privileged understanding of what movement looks like. For most college campuses, this is one of the biggest complaints that they have, is that their campuses simply aren't accessible because there aren't enough wheelchair ramps, there aren't enough like accessible doorways, there aren't enough elevators to get people where they're going, or if there are, they're overcrowded. There are so many ways that ableism becomes pervasive, not only in our everyday lives, but they've become specifically represented in college campuses. A good way to look at this is thinking about invisible disabilities. A lot of times, and this is a very ableist belief, is that if someone has a disability, then you will be able to see it. Either they're in a wheelchair, or they have a limp, or they're using a crutch, something like that. But unfortunately, a lot of disabilities are invisible. Just going back to the definition for ableism, there are psychiatric, intellectual disabilities that don't have a physical realization. And so a lot of times these people get looked over as not having a disability. A good example is Carly Medosh. She spoke at a conference at Stanford School of Medicine, and she was advocating on behalf of people with invisible disabilities, and she was presenting a lot of her own story because she suffers from two chronic pain illnesses, Crohn's and fibromyalgia, and she, just looking at her picture, doesn't necessarily look like she might have a disability. She's standing. There aren't any other signs that would necessarily indicate that she suffers from chronic illnesses. So that was kind of her story, and as she presented it, she did a lot of work to help advocate for not only the rights, but also the understanding for people with invisible disabilities. And then on the right side of the screen here is a quote from Wayne Connell. He's the founder of the Invisible Disabilities Association. He has a wife who has an intellectual disability. So he talked at the same conference and gave a little bit more input. He said, you know, it's that invisible nature of an illness that people don't understand. We'd park in disabled parking and she didn't use a wheelchair or a cane, and so people would always give us dirty looks and scream at us. So this is a really good practical application, not necessarily on college campuses, but in everyday life, of how people with invisible disabilities are overlooked and their marginalization becomes even more prominent. It's a very privileged understanding of disabilities to think that if someone has one, you'll be able to see it, when that simply is not true. So this becomes really important when thinking about the ideal college student and how sometimes these invisible disabilities, whether it be psychiatric or intellectual, can really come into play when understanding why someone might not show up to class one day. So this is kind of the application that we have to college students. This is a really broad topic to talk about all kinds of different forms of ableism that you see on a college campus. It would take a lot more time than I have, and it's also a much larger discussion. So we're just going to be focusing in on college campuses and some of the practical applications we see specifically regarding attendance policies. But to start with this, one of the really big factors that people might not always be reminded of, although they might see it if you're active in a college campus or you know someone who attends college, but 20% of college students reported suffering from anxiety or depression. So while these might not necessarily be what you think of when you think of a disability, these are psychiatric disabilities that hinder students' learning, hinder their education, and hinder their simple ability to go to class one day. So this is just one of the many factors that might go into understanding why someone doesn't show up for class and why a mandatory or not mandatory attendance policy can harm some students in the way that they're able to participate in a college education. This is a little bit more of a funny interpretation. So this is just a little meme, and it says skipping class, high school, and it has a picture of a girl shaking in the principal's office versus college, where she's snoozing her alarm and saying, this is costing me $100, worth it. A common interpretation of why students don't show up for their classes in college is because they're lazy, they're tired, they don't want to go. And the thing is in college, people assume that there aren't mandatory attendance policies. So both of these things can be false. A lot of college courses do have attendance mandatory policies, or they have some form of an attendance policy, which we'll get into later. And then again, going back to this idea that just because a student doesn't show up for class doesn't mean they're lazy. It doesn't mean that they value their education any less than their instructor wants them to. Again, there are certain things that go into play. such as anxiety or depression, or an intellectual/learning disability, or even a physical disability. So these kind of help us focus in on how attendance in college courses can be exclusive and how it continues to marginalize students with disabilities. So an example of a college attendance policy, this is one from a class that I currently take. This is a little bit harsher, but I think it also kind of delves into some of the underlying beliefs that influence attendance policies. So it says, your success and the success of this course depend on your active participation. Therefore, your regular attendance is required. University policy states that a student whose absences are excessive may run the risk of receiving a lower grade or a failing grade, regardless of his or her performance in the class. You run that risk if you exceed 2 absences. If you miss a class, it is your responsibility to get the assignments, class notes, and course changes from a classmate. You are allowed 2 total absences. This includes both excused and unexcused. At 8 absences, I reserve the right to fail you for the course. And it's really important to note at this point that this is a TV script writing class. So it's workshop based, students bring in their script writing, then it's workshopped as a group. So that kind of explains this next note. But it says, excessive absences will also affect your workshop participation grade. Sharing writing is a brave and sometimes anxiety-ridden experience. In order to create the supportive community necessary for writers to prosper, we must all attend class. So knowing what you know so far as we've gone through this presentation, it's pretty obvious that there are a couple of underlying beliefs about what in-class participation is and who is allowed to participate in it. So the first thing I want to point out is that this, at the top, it says that that your regular attendance is required. So that would be a little bit more of a mandatory attendance policy. Some other college courses don't have mandatory attendance policies, but they do have attendance policies where if you go and you show that you went to class, then you get extra bonus points or extra credits, something like that. While those aren't mandatory attendance policies, they are still discriminatory against students with disabilities because they don't allow them to actively participate in getting that extra credit. So it's not fair to reward those that are able-bodied and continue to discourage those students with disabilities from being more active and being participatory in class. Because again, in-class participation is not the only way to learn. It's just the most common form of learning practices that you see in college campuses, especially for liberal arts colleges. Second thing to point out in this attendance policy, and this is just a little excerpt of it, it says, excessive absences will also affect your workshop participation grade. So for this class, it's important to note that before coming to class, students are required to read through the scripts and comment on them. So before students even come to class, they're already engaging with the work. This is not to say that doing everything at home is the solution to helping students with disabilities. It's simply to note that obviously the workshop participation grade can't only be based on what you say in class, but rather there are other ways to verbalize this commentary through online systems that college campuses offer that are very accessible, or through other means. And the last thing to note from this attendance policy is that it says sharing writing is a brave and sometimes anxiety-ridden experience. In order to create the supportive community necessary for writers to prosper, we must all attend class. I think this is the best visualization from this policy of just how much students with disabilities are discredited from college courses. To say that sharing writing is a brave and sometimes anxiety-ridden experience is a very fair comment. It absolutely is. But adding on to this pressure of students with disabilities, so it's not just the pressure to share their written work, it's also the pressure that they have to be there. If someone with, say, a chronic illness, like Carly Medosh, that we saw before, say they were to have like a Crohn's inflammation one day in class and they couldn't make it there to share their work, then they have extra anxiety on top of the anxiety that they would have from sharing their work in the first place. So it's clear that these mandatory attendance policies continue to disadvantage students because it adds extra stress, extra anxiety on top of something that they can't control. So this is just a quick little insight onto how these attendance policies can really disadvantage students with disabilities. And another thing to point out is that my opinion is obviously not the only opinion. It's really important to point out what people with disabilities have to say about this issue. It's important to note that while Twitter isn't necessarily recognized as an academic source, it's clear that students with disabilities are disadvantaged from being included in academic writing and from academic spaces. So it's necessary to center their voices no matter where you see them. So this is a Twitter thread. We start off at the top with Acorn Connoisseur. They tweeted, "Attendance is ableist," and then had this little emoji with it. And then there were other comments that are really important to share and really give a voice to students with disabilities and how they feel about the issue. So Coffee Spoonie comments and says, "Mandatory attendance is what made college the most inaccessible to me. As someone with a chronic illness who often could not get to campus / leave my bed, even though I could always follow along with the coursework from the day at home, which very few professors allowed me to do." So it's really important to point out that even for students that have access to accommodations for their disabilities, or who can do well in their coursework, maybe not an intellectual or learning disability, they still have problems with these mandatory attendance policies because it's not possible every day to go to class. And then below that, Acorn Connoisseur comments again and says, "I almost dropped out 2 years ago because of it. It's the hardest part of my schooling. I feel the same about following at home, and I don't personally struggle with assignments or due dates as badly as I do with attendance." So this goes back again to the claim that the students that don't come to class are the ones that don't do well because they're lazy and they don't want to participate. But in fact, these students a lot of times are just students with disabilities that can't participate in the physical attendance. But again, there are other manifestations of this. They do well on their online homework. They're able to participate online. It's really important not to discredit students with disabilities from academic spaces just because physical attendance isn't always a top priority or something that's possible. Then on the right side of the screen, there's a comment from Sherlock Bud Brown. And they comment, "Man, do I remember having to be so dissociated I felt barely alive just so I could haul my ass to class. And honestly, in uni, while I get the purpose of attendance because some people just won't show, they're paying for it, let them be dumb. Like I've been trained to think mental illness isn't an excuse. Like I have major depression, ADHD, and an eating disorder that seriously affects my physical health, especially when in recovery. And all my classes are up a literal mountain of stairs with no accessibility unless you register and are approved for disability." I think what they're commenting about specifically in here is accommodations that a lot of students receive if they have documented proof, have had documented proof of their disability for a long period of time and are able to present that to their professors and receive that accommodation from them. So this is just a really good way not only to highlight the voices of students with disabilities, but to also give a little bit of input on how what we've been talking about so far is the real life lived experiences of these students. This isn't just like a one case scenario. Like look back at the fact that 20% of students are struggling with anxiety and depression in college. For a lot of those students, it's hard to go to class, and mandatory attendance policies further isolate them from college courses. So something that was brought up in the last part is accommodations. What about them? How do they work? Are they accessible? Does this help students enough to make them participatory in college courses? So accommodations do not guarantee academic success. The student is still responsible for learning subject knowledge, demonstrating mastery of content, satisfying the essential requirements of courses, showing progression towards major, meeting the same demands required of all students. So this is an excerpt from the Penn State University's accommodation website from their Center of Disabilities. And this is just a quick overview of what exactly accommodations do and don't do. There are lots of different manifestations of accommodations. For students with a hearing disability, it might be recorded lectures that are then typed out. For students with a physical disability that doesn't allow them to write, it might be someone that comes to class and is a scribe for them and takes notes. For students with insomnia, it might be not having to schedule classes early in the morning. There are so many different ways that accommodations are manifested in college campuses, and although they might seem like the perfect solution, they aren't for every student. A big reason for why this is that to get accommodations, you have to have documented proof of your disability. So for a student in a college campus who might not have had previous documented proof of anxiety or depression or a learning disorder that they think they might have, it can be really hard to get these accommodations for all different sorts of reasons, financial, time constraints, or even cultural stigmas. For people that come from cultures where disabilities are frowned upon and make you seem weak, then getting an accommodation and having that documented proof isn't as easy as Penn State wants you to think it is. And again, these accommodations don't mean that students with disabilities are on a level playing field with all other students. They still find themselves at disadvantages. Going back to the Twitter thread we read over, it's clear that those students, when they had accommodations, still didn't find themselves accessible in college campuses. So, kind of the big point of this is figuring out how we value these stories, specifically from students with disabilities, and focusing in on how academic writing, academic spaces in general, then become created and founded upon students that are able-bodied, professors that are able-bodied, academics that are able-bodied. So it was really important when creating this presentation, not only that it centered the voices of students with disabilities, but that it stayed away from academic writing. It's really important when thinking about how to solve this issue and where we can go from here, that it's not just letting students with disabilities skip class. It really comes down to restructuring academic spaces, valuing in-class discussions as the end-all be-all of education and making that what every student should strive for is kind of what makes college inaccessible in the first place. So it really goes down to finding more creative solutions, more innovative ways, not only to learn, but to be a college student. It comes down to rebranding this idea of an ideal college student. It's not the student that goes to class. It's not the student that does perfectly on every assignment. It's the student that is willing to participate in their education, not only in a physical way. It comes down to learning what you can in all the ways that you can. And this is something that's really hard to do. Just by me giving this presentation doesn't mean that we've solved the issue of ableism in college courses. It just means that we've started a conversation about how we can go about doing that. So just taking the step to move away from academic writing and look more at centering the voices of students with disabilities, that's just one of the ways that we can move towards reshaping educational spaces. And this comes down to the last question: are in-class discussions the only way to learn? While it might be a good way to learn for students that are able-bodied, it can sometimes really disadvantage students with disabilities. So restructuring academic spaces, trying out new things, it's on the part of professors and academics to be more inclusive to students with disabilities and to be aware that just by asking students to come to class every day or by telling them they only have 2 excused and unexcused absences, they're pushing students with disabilities away from being a part of academic spaces, and that is unfair and ableist. So, how can we do this? It's important to start the conversation, not only in an academic space, but especially from a position of privilege. As someone who doesn't have a disability and is relatively able-bodied, it's really important not only to speak out in favor of restructuring educational spaces, but to continue to highlight the voices of students with disabilities. Taking the most vulnerable in a population and highlighting them in this continued change and this transformation is imperative to creating a college campus that is accessible to everyone. So, can we do it? Can we not do it? It's really important to think that when we're fixing this issue, we're making college campuses, making the world a little bit more accessible every day. So thank you.
What?